Many oil palm plantations have been established on degraded rainforests. So to start, could you explain the different stages the land has usually gone through before becoming an oil palm plantation?
Thank you, Denise. So I think there are a number of different pathways in which oil palm can develop on land. Typically, the stories we hear are that land is forested land, rainforest land is cleared and often burnt and then turned into oil palm plantation. But that is actually only in a minority of cases. Much of the land on which oil palm develops has actually already been used for other purposes prior to it being turned over to oil palm. So for example, oil palm is developed upon land that was formerly rice paddy and has been rice paddy for a long time. Many rubber plantations have been more recently turned over to oil palm plantation, but also logging of tropical rainforest leads to forest degradation, of course. After maybe 2 rounds of logging, it's often become more profitable to then clear that land and turn it into oil palm. So oil palm expansion is happening very often in either former croplands or on degraded forest. Now, at the same time, oil palm expansion has also happened on areas of undisturbed forest. That does happen. We shouldn't hide that, but it's a very mixed picture. So in terms of development of oil palm, it's actually much cheaper to plant oil palm in areas where you don't have to clear the forest, particularly in rice paddies, which are rice being much less profitable than it used to be. So in terms of forest clearance, yes, oil palm expands on areas that were formerly forested land, but often oil palm is not the immediate cause of deforestation. It's a subsequent crop that is planted on areas that were formerly deforested for other reasons.
What percentage, more or less, of oil palm plantations nowadays are on former rainforest areas?
I think in terms of a very rough estimate, based on some of the studies that have been done, is about 20 to 30% of oil palm expansion has been a direct cause of deforestation of relatively undisturbed forest. Whereas much of the rest of it, about 2/3, has been on land that has already been degraded or already formally cleared for other purposes.
During the first big palm oil boom in the 20th centuries, what role have national and international entities played?
So oil palm expansion has developed very, very quickly in the last 2 or 3 decades. And often we're very quick to blame the producer countries, mainly Malaysia and Indonesia. But in fact, it's a globally traded commodity. And so many organizations, and including many European, American, Japanese companies, at least have some role to play in this, because they are the ones that are buying the oil palm, it being a globally traded commodity. So they are in effect driving the expansion of oil palm by responding to the market demand for it. So many European companies are in effect enabling the expansion of oil palm. Now, that's not to say that in more recent years, they haven't been trying to address some of the deficiencies of oil palm production by introducing sustainable production regimes. But we need to recognize that it's inappropriate to simply blame the companies that are producing oil palm on the ground and growing it, because they are responding to a global market. The other big players, of course, are the banks that fund activities on the ground. And so many companies that are planting oil palm can only do so if they get loans to establish the palm oil plantations in the first place. And those loans often come from European or other international banks, and there's a responsibility on those banks to ensure that their money is being used to fund activities that are sustainable. That has not happened in the past. Banks have been all too willing to lend their capital without doing appropriate due diligence. But I think in recent years that again is changing, so that the banks are funding activities and placing much more emphasis on proving the sustainability of those activities before making the loans.
And how has the role of national entities in Indonesia and Malaysia changed?
In Indonesia and Malaysia, there are ministries that are responsible for overseeing the management of oil palm and the expansion of oil palm, as well as the trade in palm oil. Now, in the past, they have recognized that oil palm expansion has brought huge benefit in terms of the economy of their countries, and particularly in terms of providing opportunities for labor and alleviating poverty. And we have to recognize also that it's brought a lot of good in terms of poverty alleviation. So these ministries have tended to support palm oil production through subsidizing saplings, through investing in research to improve productivity, through creating domestic market demand, often by encouraging the use of palm oil for biodiesel within the country. So this elevates the demand and in effect creates an artificial demand within the country itself to promote further expansion of palm oil. Recently, there's been a recognition that many of the practices of the past have been inappropriate, deforestation and human rights infringements. And so many of these ministries and organizations are being to evaluate how oil palm expansion and management should take place. So there's much greater emphasis now on sustainable practices. The most obvious response to that is by adopting the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, but this is actually very difficult for many smallholders to do. So Indonesia, for example, has developed its own system, the Indonesian Sustainable Palm Oil Initiative. And it is trying to make this mandatory across all palm oil producers across Indonesia. But that in itself is a huge challenge.
So there has been a lot of effort worldwide to establish standards for sustainable palm oil. What does actually sustainable palm oil mean or stand for?
Okay, I mean, that's a great question because we can simply trust that the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil has criteria and indicators which are accepted as being sustainable in terms of conserving forests, in terms of preserving biodiversity, in terms of minimizing pollutant inputs, in terms of labor rights and well-being of people in the region. But in the end, it's up to us to scrutinize those standards. The standards at the moment are mostly focused on the management of the oil palm plantations themselves, particularly focusing on labor issues and human rights issues, but also in terms of the application of pesticides and fertilizers and the extent to which they affect or impact waterways or soil. Deforestation is, of course, an issue of concern. So that is also within the standards in that you cannot be certified if you are proven to have cleared forest for oil palm plantation. But many would argue that those standards are not strong enough. For one thing, they apply mainly to the management area itself, but many of the impacts of oil palm production extend well beyond the boundaries of the plantation itself, and they're often not taken into account in sustainability standards. Many would argue that the standards on biodiversity are not stringent enough. There's something called high conservation value forests, which are patches of forest which are retained within palm oil plantations that are a requirement of the standards. But the quality of those high conservation value forests is often not assessed. And when you look at them, very often they're relatively degraded, small patches of forest that are relatively ineffective in supporting biodiversity. So yes, we could critique the standards, and there's a lot of initiatives now to see how we can improve those standards in the future.
So you mentioned that especially for small-scale farmers, it's difficult for them to get the certification for sustainable palm oil. What's the main challenge for them?
So there are a couple of challenges. The first is access to information and knowledge. Many of them are not even aware that standards exist. Those that are aware don't see it as something that is directly relevant to them, but is the responsibility of the big companies. The second is their capacity to implement these standards. So it would require them to invest in improved systems for fertilizer or pesticide application, in monitoring biodiversity, in retaining forest patches across the landscape, And many smallholders, who are often very poor farmers who might only own a few hectares of land, have no capacity to do this. And thirdly is the cost. The cost of proving that their management system is meeting the standards required for certification. So there are a lot of transaction costs and administrative costs that they would not be able to bear. So those are the three main aims. The first is lack of knowledge, the second, lack of capacity, and the third is lack of financing.
You also mentioned the impact of palm oil on biodiversity. When I see oil palm plantations, they look quite monotonic to me. Mm-hmm. Are most plantations monocultures? And why is this the case? Yes.
It is indeed true that most plantations are monocultures. It's also true that monoculture plantations support very, very little biodiversity. And that's of immediate concern, given that expansion has been in areas which have in the past been very rich in biodiversity, particularly areas of Southeast Asia. Now, the challenge of making oil palm plantations more diverse, many people have advocated mixed cropping systems where you mix oil palm trees with other crop systems or even with in agroforestry systems. But so far that has been proved very difficult to make it work in terms of the productivity of the oil palm. The reason why oil palm is such an attractive commodity is that it's highly productive. You can get a lot of vegetable oil from very little land, but you can only do so when it's planted in monoculture. As soon as it's planted with other plants, then there is often overlapping competition for resources among those plants, either for light or for below ground nutrients, and that reduces the profitability or the productivity of oil palm. Having said that, early in oil palm plantation establishment, there are intercropping systems where crops such as beans or other crops can be grown initially in between the rows of seedlings of oil palm, because oil palm takes about 3 or 4 years to become productive. And in the meantime, farmers need to plant other crops to have an income in those 3 or 4 years before they begin to get productivity from oil palm. But as soon as productivity of oil palm comes on stream, then the farmers often abandon those other crops because they can make much more money just by focusing on the oil palm commodity itself.
So the other day I came up on this margarine in Migros made in Switzerland with rapeseed oil in it and a big label saying no palm oil, pretty much suggesting to the consumer that it is good to omit palm oil. So when you have a shelf in front of you, let's say with margarine with palm oil in it, rapeseed oil, and the normal butter, which one would you choose?
Well, I like butter, and butter made from local commodities is always what I would go for. So it's true. I think we need to recognize that palm oil is in many, many commodities that we encounter on the supermarket shelves. And we have a choice. We can choose commodities without palm oil. And there's, if you have that choice, by all means make it. But we also need to recognize that boycotting oil palm is not necessarily a good thing, because we are simply substituting vegetable oil from palm oil for vegetable oil from some other commodity. So we need to think about what is the impact of sourcing vegetable oil from rapeseed or from soy. Now, if it was rapeseed, then this has impact on the European landscape because rapeseed is planted across much of Europe, also North America. In North America, rapeseed is grown in huge quantities, and that has very damaging effects on the environment. So just because we switch from oil palm to another vegetable oil, such as rapeseed oil, does not necessarily eliminate environmental impact. But additionally, we need to recognize that palm oil is hugely productive. So we can get roughly 6 times as much vegetable oil from 1 hectare of land than from rapeseed or from soy. So to put it in another context, if we are replacing vegetable oil in our margarine with oil from, let's say, soy, then we need 6 times as much area of land for soy to get that vegetable oil from soy than we do from oil palm. Now, soy is grown in Brazil, and much of the Brazilian Amazon and the Cerrado in Brazil has been turned over to soy. So we need to think about making decisions intelligently, and simply switching from palm oil to another vegetable oil does not necessarily deliver the environmental benefits that we might want. I would argue that rapeseed is definitely better than palm oil. It's grown locally, it's sourced locally, it supports local farmers within Europe, but it does still have an environmental impact that we need to be aware of.
So when the EU actually voted for a ban of palm oil in biodiesel, their proclaimed aim was to stop deforestation, rainforests in Indonesia and Malaysia. So does a ban rather have the opposite effect in the end?
I think if there was a ban instituted on palm oil imports, firstly, that would have to be global. It cannot just be focused on Indonesia and Malaysia. And if it is, then I think Indonesia and Malaysia will take this to the WTO. And I think they already have, because they feel that it's unfair discrimination. So if the ban was to be a global ban on imports of palm oil into the EU, then this could affect the promotion of good practice elsewhere in the world, particularly in countries like Colombia, which are really promoting research into much better practice. So that could be a problem which indirectly undermines efforts to reduce deforestation in Indonesia, because the good practices that are being promoted by Colombia will no longer be transferable to Indonesia and Malaysia. So that's an indirect route. A more direct route is that I don't think it will stop deforestation in Indonesia and Malaysia, simply because those countries will simply switch their production or their exports to other countries, such as India and China. Now, once that happens and those trade routes are established, it's very difficult to then reduce the influence of those markets on the Indonesian market, because trade agreements would already have been established. So if anything, it might even drive more deforestation. Now, having said that, we also need to be careful, because Indonesia and Malaysia have already adopted very strict standards which state that there's no more deforestation allowed. So legally now, clearance of forest, of pristine forest at least, is no longer allowed in either Indonesia or Malaysia for oil palm development. So the ban will not necessarily stop that, because that's already been stopped. It's already illegal. You can question the enforcement of that, but in terms of legality, there is no more deforestation as a result of oil palm expansion in Indonesia and Malaysia.
So how can this new law in Indonesia be enforced? As you just mentioned, that's maybe difficult.
Yes, I mean, it often is difficult, particularly, it's actually easier to monitor the big companies. So monitoring, the companies are dependent upon licenses from the government for oil palm production, and they're also very exposed to public scrutiny, and therefore they're much more responsive to enforcement. It's in their interest to demonstrate that they are not doing deforestation or adopting bad practices. And that can be fairly easily checked. Remote sensing technology allows us to monitor almost on a week-by-week basis of what is happening in terms of forest clearance and oil palm expansion. That is what we can do right now. And we can and use that in terms of reporting of against the standards and legality requirements. What is much, much more difficult is enforcement for smallholder communities. So smallholders often do clear forests, and that is much more difficult to track, much more difficult to enforce, and much more difficult to measure.
One participant is asking, how do the political systems within the palm oil producing nations impact the values of sustainability that are now demanded by users in Western nations, for instance, in Malaysia?
Well, Malaysia has a very democratic system. There's a very strong pressure to promote sustainability and maintain much of the natural landscapes and natural heritage that Malaysia still has. A lot of Malaysia's economy is based upon tourism, and much of that is nature-based tourism. So there is a very, very strong movement within Malaysia to promote sustainability, particularly in the oil palm sector. And Indonesia and Malaysia, they're both democratic states, and they are responding to this. The leader of Indonesia a couple of years ago made a lot of emphasis on the need to enforce the no deforestation regulations, particularly for oil palm. So I think there is a big political movement, both an informal political movement among the civil society, but also a movement that is recognized within government to promote and respond to the need to promote sustainability. So in Indonesia, there's been recent discussions which are very cross-sectoral about instituting a new national action plan or strategic plan on oil palm expansion and development. And very much at the heart of that are issues of sustainability and good practice.
So before you mentioned the roundtable for sustainable palm oil, and Indonesia and Malaysia are also establishing their own standards. Mm-hmm. Why are they doing this? Why can we not just have one standard?
Yes, I mean, that's a good question. Many argue that Malaysian standards and Indonesian standards are being developed so that those countries can avoid having to adhere to the much stricter standards of the RSPO or other requirements. In other words, if they can say that their oil palm is certified according to their national standards, then, and if those national standards are somewhat weaker than international standards as set by RSPO, then clearly they will not have to adopt such strict management practices that RSPO requires. The difficulty that they face is that those national standards are simply not internationally recognized at the moment. So they don't have international credibility. Consumers in Europe, for example, retailers or wholesalers simply do not place enough credibility on the Indonesian sustainable palm oil standard, and therefore it's not widely adopted. On the other hand, the advantage of those national standards is that they are mandatory, unlike RSPO. So Indonesia is saying that every single producer has to be ISPO certified, Indonesian Sustainable Palm Oil certified, which, if that is implemented, means that at least every single producer in Indonesia, ranging from smallholders to big companies, have to adhere to these basic minimal standards. And that is currently not the case. So at the moment, many producers don't comply to any standards at all. The adoption of ISPO, if we can, or if they can scale it out across the whole country, will mean at least that minimal standards are in place, even though those minimal standards may not be accepted internationally.
Do you think that's the way forward, that they first try to fulfill these minimal requirements by the national standards, and maybe at a later stage these palm oil farmers try to be RSPO certified?
Yes, I think that's a very realistic way of moving forward. Now, even though those standards may not be sufficient to meet our values or our hopes, they are nonetheless minimal standards. And if that can be adopted across the country, that would be an excellent step forward. We also have to recognize that realistically, there's no way that many companies or many smallholders can aspire to RSPO standards at the present time. They simply don't have the capacity and cannot afford to do that. But there is the possibility for them to scale up to ISPO standards and adopt that. Once in a few years' time, let's say, once they're able to achieve the ISPO standards, they'll be in a much better position to then improve their production management systems a little bit further so that they can be channeled towards RSPO standards. So I think it's an important first step, and the fact that it's mandatory is also very, very important.
We have more questions from the audience, especially on the sustainability of palm oil. One participant is asking what we can do as consumers, especially here in Switzerland, to drive the move towards supporting sustainable production of palm oil.
Mm-hmm. So I think certainly we need to be placing increasing pressure on the companies that import palm oil, including retailers such as Migros and Coop, but also some of the big retailers, including Nestle, Unilever, and so on, to ensure that all the palm oil that they source is coming from sustainable sources. Now, a lot of companies are making big efforts in this regard, but it is very challenging. Many companies such as Unilever have pledged to have all palm oil in their supply chains to be guaranteed to come from sustainable sources. But we need to obviously hold those companies to account. We need to check on the transparency of that and the credibility of that. And one of the big challenges is how do you prove that the palm oil that says it's sustainable is actually indeed sustainable? Because it's very difficult to track all the way back to the producers a particular kilo of oil palm is actually coming from a sustainable source. But many companies are placing a lot of emphasis in researching this and in developing tracking systems for transparency of certification of certified oil palm supply. It's our duty to continue to ask those questions, to place pressure on them so that they continue to invest in those kinds of systems. In terms of our choices that we make in supermarkets, and obviously I would promote the idea that we should be buying commodities which have clearly coming from sustainable sources by checking on the labels. This can be very confusing because often there are many labels, and also oil palm is in many commodities that we're often not even aware of. But simply keeping ourselves informed, looking out for labels, and keeping the pressure up on the companies that are importing oil palm are the three things that we can do.
So is Migros and, for example, Coop doing something to track if their palm oil that they are sourcing is really sustainable?
I think they are, yes. And I think the good thing is about Migros and Coop is that they are very much engaged in issues of public awareness or public concern about palm oil, and they've made considerable efforts to ensure that they are sourcing from companies that can guarantee sustainable palm oil. Now, I think they still have a lot to do in terms of improving the standards, but also in terms of being important influencers. So Migros and Coop are relatively small supermarkets in the context of the global market. There are much bigger supermarkets, of course, across Europe. But they, I think, have an important role to play because they are often leaders in promoting good practice. So by adopting good practice, by pushing the boundaries, by placing pressure, by continually advocating for more sustainable and better practices and the transparency of the supply chains, then they can set the goals or set the targets that other supermarkets across Europe may have to then later adhere to. So I think supermarkets and retailers in Switzerland have a very important role in setting the best standards, which, and in so doing, will leverage influence across many other retailers and supermarkets across Europe.
So Switzerland is about to sign a new free trade agreement with Indonesia, together with the European Free Trade Association. Palm oil, of course, also forms part of it. There is provision in it, and some NGOs and parties are very much concerned about this provision on palm oil. What's your opinion on this new free trade agreement that is about to be signed?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much information about the details of the free trade agreement. I know there was some discussion about whether tariffs should be placed on palm oil as a commodity, and that's obviously something that that Indonesia and Malaysia were resisting. They were arguing for duty-free palm oil imports into Switzerland. And to be honest, I don't know what the latest is on that. I don't know what decisions were taken on that eventually. But I think we should also recognize that we need to be careful about what is motivating these kinds of decisions. Now, vegetable oil from oil palm is very cheap, and I think there's a lot of concern for the farmers within Europe and within Switzerland in terms of the extent to which they will be undermined by competition from vegetable oil brought in as a result of imports of palm oil. So much of these trade agreements are not necessarily motivated by environmental concerns or human rights concerns in Indonesia and Malaysia, but more by the need to continue to support European or Swiss farmers who are producing rapeseed, for example. The politics behind this is very opaque. It's very difficult to figure out what the real motivation behind these agreements are. And I don't have the details of the latest, the final decision that was made. But I would argue that it's going to be almost impossible to stop imports of palm oil. And I think even it's counterproductive, because if we were to do that, we would simply have to replace the vegetable oil with some other commodity, which could even be more damaging, be it soy or rapeseed or something else. So I think we need to be realistic about this. And I think Europe, whatever agreement it reaches with Indonesia and Malaysia, needs to have a very good very good dialogue with Indonesia and Malaysia to emphasize the importance of sustainable production for the European consumers, and to work with these countries and the companies involved to really promote best practice. And I think dialogue is much better than simply putting up barriers for trade, either through duties and tariffs or by bans.
So palm oil forms part of so many products, also packaged products here in Switzerland. Would it be even possible to produce enough rapeseed oil and other vegetable oils in Switzerland to replace palm oil?
No, I doubt it. I mean, if we were to go down that line where we were completely to ban all palm oil imports, which I think is completely unrealistic, but as a thought experiment, if we were to do that, and if we were to rely on domestic production, European production of rapeseed, we would have to convert huge amounts of land to rapeseed production simply to meet the European demand. So I think that's simply not credible. It would come at a huge cost, of course, because the cost of producing rapeseed is much, much higher than of importing palm oil. So we need to think, where is the money going to come from to support those farmers for the costs incurred? The alternative is, of course, to import other types of oil. And we already talked about soy. Soy would require a lot more land, and that land would come from deforestation in the Amazon and in the Cerrado, which is happening now as we speak.